Hi, everybody. Today's March 1st. We managed to leap over a leap day of leap year. That's 2024. And I'm honored to have an actual journalist, Jonathan Choe, with me. He is bi-coastal. He comes from this neck of the woods where I am, Boston area, and currently lives in Seattle. If we can call it living, if
Got
Seattle.
got to get the Starbucks, home
Yeah.
base of Starbucks.
Um, So, Jonathan, tell us a little bit about yourself, your journey, what you've been up to, what is journalism, and who does it these days?
Um, well, I'll just start off by saying I'm an independent journalist now. After 20 plus years in corporate media, I've worked for a lot of the major networks: ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, Tribune, in markets like Boston, my hometown, Seattle now, Minneapolis, Chicago. But I made the pivot a couple years ago. And now I'm also a senior fellow at Discovery Institute. It's a Seattle-based think tank, and the group is essentially underwriting my work. And I'm focused primarily on the homeless crisis, the drug addiction crisis, and everything else that goes into that pot. So I'm having a lot of fun right now, and in this day and age where we're seeing a decline in television news ratings as well as the decline in newspapers across the country. As an independent journalist, I'm just now trying to fill the void and the so-called news deserts where communities are now barely getting any coverage at all.
I appreciate that, and thank you. Elon Musk recently, I think yesterday, posted, anybody following legacy news is not getting news. Can you tell us what he meant by that, and what is old about news, and what's new about news? What are the qualifications for something getting in, say, the legacy media? And, are there sins of omission as well as sins of commission amongst the, news elite?
Yeah, well, getting back to Musk, I saw that post, and I think he's spot on. But I think what he means by that is that when it comes to mainstream legacy media, again, I'm operating in the television world, and let's just use the Boston news market for example. You've got the Boston Globe, the Boston Herald in newspaper land, and then you've got a whole host of radio stations, and you've got the TV stations, right? You've got Channel 7, 5, 4, NBC, and Fox 25, and that's considered legacy traditional media, along with cable that we see as well. But what Musk is talking about is the inconvenient truth and really the worst kept secret. If you're in the industry, the reality is, as a journalist, you really don't have control. What that means is you can pitch a story, say about the Black Lives Matter riots, from several years ago in Seattle. I pitched a story about the fact that I started to realize that this wasn't just about civil rights and social justice for Black folks. The BLM movement was essentially hijacked by the far left, Antifa, Marxists, the entire LGBTQ movement. And I wanted to do that story because I started going to all these marches and protests. It was a bunch of white kids dressed in black ninja outfits trashing local businesses. And I was looking around, I'm like, where are all the black leaders? This had nothing to do with the civil rights movement of, Martin Luther King Jr. back in the 60s. So I wanted to give that context. But my news director at the time said, Cho, great idea, but it's too controversial. Let's just leave that alone and let's just cover what's happening on the ground. That's an example of where you have corporate interests superseding the interests of, I believe, the public and what's really happening. And, fast forward 3-4 years later, we now know that BLM was a global fraud, and it has been hijacked, and it's essentially about pushing a far left Marxist socialist agenda. So that's the type of stuff that I feel like a journalist is supposed to expose. And, I kind of am in the realm of investigative journalism, and you're going to, it's going to lead you down a lot of rabbit trails if you're really digging and to a lot of inconvenient truths. And in corporate media, at the end of the day, it's a business. It's not a public trust. It's a business. These television stations, cable outlets, newspapers are now owned by just a handful of corporate conglomerates that are publicly traded. So at the end of the day, if you can't sell diaper ads or baby formula next to a story, then the story's not going to get green lighted. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I kind of feel in Men in Black, the movie, there are these creatures that take up other people's bodies, and beneath them they're aliens. There's an invasion of the body snatchers, same kind of concept. I feel as if there's kind of the same facade, that there's a mask, a veneer, a label of news, but beneath it, it's not really the same thing anymore. And ironically enough, Harvard and the elite institutions have gone through the same change. They built up trust and they built up credentials over centuries, say, and at the very least decades in the last century, whatnot. And you see beneath it, there's not really that thing there anymore. It's kind of like the guy running the shop in Men in Black. It's not really a shopkeeper. It's somebody else. It's an alien soul that's inhabited it. And I'm sorry about the analogy, but I feel like the purveyors of our knowledge are not really that knowledgeable, and they are doing things for other purposes. So they've been hijacked themselves, and/or invasion of the body snatchers, taken over by alien beings. But the irony is that you were in Harvard Square just the other day, and unfortunately we didn't cross paths, because I would have loved to see it in person. I love the interviews you do, kind of mise en scène, and getting people to state their thoughts. I don't know if you want to touch on the intersection of this the two things, the academia and journalism, kind of going down the tubes at the same time, and whether those are connected, and what's really at play, and who are their masters, A, and B, maybe you can go through your humorous scene in Harvard Square.
Yeah, I mean, we could have another 2-hour-long podcast if you want me to break down exactly what I think about the state of American journalism and how it intertwines with academia and the elites. Look, I grew up in Boston, East Coast. The stereotype to some degree is true: power, wealth, prestige, and the media elites. That's kind of what's been fueling it all. And independent journalism, especially with the rise of social media platforms like X, is undercutting all of that. So, you followed, what happened with Claudine Gay, the former president of Harvard, and her plagiarism scandal. And I had the privilege of recently being part of a fellowship with Chris Rufo, Aaron, Aaron Burnett, and rather Aaron Siberium and Chris Burnett. And those are the three fellows that essentially broke that story and started the pressure campaign that eventually took Claudine Gay down. And what was really interesting is that this is exactly what we were talking about. Legacy mainstream media, places like the Washington Post and the New York Times, they were running cover for Claudine, and they were omitting the story from the headlines. In other words, they weren't covering the story for various reasons. Meanwhile, you've had all these independent journalists simply following the paper trail, all the facts, the inconvenient truths, which led to the ultimate ouster of Claudine Gay. And that's what journalism, I thought, was about, going after the truth, putting things into the sunlight, and, holding people accountable, especially public officials, if there's wrongdoing or corruption. But that ethos and that value system seems to be out the window now. I'm talking to, journalists right now who remain in newsrooms, and there's just usually a class of 3 journalists left now. You've got the senior veteran who's just trying to hold on to his or her job before retirement. Then you've got the mid-career journalist who's about to pivot into public relations because there's double the money working at Amazon, or the young journalist who simply somehow jumped from, their college graduation to a top 50 market, which is now unheard of. In other words, American journalism is in crisis. It's not the same, and it's going through a reckoning right now. And again, I'm an independent journalist now for a reason. I'm going to bet on myself. There are revenue streams out there, especially through digital and social media, to make a living. And part of that also requires you to link up now with nonprofits and, think tanks and other institutions, which I believe will ultimately, be fueling this type of journalism moving forward. There's no other way.
Well, I thank you for that, and I appreciate your bravery. Certainly, the Tucker Carlson Fox divorce helped I think, perhaps sway the minds of similar journalism actual practitioners. Before we move off Claudine Gay, I want to point out that the major story, that, certainly the plagiarism showed the emperor's, new clothes were no clothes, and it's kind of left the lie of what she was actually plagiarizing, because the stuff she was plagiarizing was second-rate material to begin with, and it wasn't really endemic or emblematic of somebody who should be theoretically the president of man's greatest university. Although I went to Yale, which so we're going to debate that topic separately. But
Go Bulldogs!
Thank you very much. But not that Yale's doing much better in this regard. They've managed to avoid the spotlight. But it came from the again, kind of the leftist takeover within the institutions. The slow march, the Marxian kind of slow march through the institutions, and the problem at Harvard was kind of the blatant violence and quasi-violence towards its Jewish students, and/or the negation of the what I call a massacre, which had happened. So that they were only in the spotlight because of that, and then they made these quizzling kind of lukewarm statements about context of what what kind of proper speech and actions emanating from speech could be practiced on campus. And obviously, if we flip the roles around, if it had been anti-black violence or anti something else, anti-gender, this and that, it would have been prosecuted to the fullest and so forth. It's kind of a blind eye based on some of their money flow, which I think there's a lot of money coming from the Middle East and so forth. I don't want to get into that too much, but before we leave the Harvard topic, you can either speak to that and/or your actual Harvard Yard.
Oh yeah, I gotta get to that.
I saw that clip, and I'd really like to hear that interaction. I love. I think she's wearing a Cape Cod shirt.
Yeah.
Like your interaction with the woman with the mask, and it was pretty much all the kind of Karen-esque. I mean, mind you, the original Karen didn't deserve to be labeled a Karen, but I think this woman might very well.
Yeah, so we didn't find Claudine Gay, unfortunately, so I couldn't ask her about the whole scandal. But my team at Turning Point USA, and I do freelance work as an independent journalist as well. We decided to go to Harvard Yard, and I had a tipster. The news industry, the lifeblood of journalism is our sources, right? And the tips that you get. And somebody reached out to me a few days ago before my Boston trip and said, "Hey, Choe, you're not going to believe this. I'm at the Harvard Kennedy School for a conference. It was the Harvard India Conference, and you had all of these executives and bigwigs and academics from India gathering at Harvard at the Kennedy School. And these Indian fellas go into the bathroom, a men's bathroom, and they see tampons and menstrual pads. And these Indian fellas, their minds are blown. They're like, am I in the right bathroom? They thought they were in a women's bathroom. So, my source contacts me and says, you got to check this out. When I first heard, I was like, this is a joke, right? No way. So I land, in Boston, Logan, immediately. My first stop is Harvard. And I go into not one, two, but three bathrooms at the Kennedy School. And you've got all these tampons in plastic containers. So, of course, we had to do the story. I reached out to Harvard, no comment. They didn't get back to us. But, of course, we did the man on the street interview. And, it was really eye-opening that you kind of had the sense overall that there's indifference now at Harvard, especially among students who are like, whatever, it's part of the culture. But at the same time, we met quite a few students who are afraid to talk to us on camera as well, saying that they're feeling pressure now simply to just go with it and stay silent, otherwise face the wrath of cancel culture. And that woman that you were referring to wearing the Cape Cod hoodie, clearly she's a townie. She's an older woman. She's probably in her 60s, and she was obviously a trans activist, but her logic made no sense to me. She was like, oh, it's no problem having menstrual pads and tampons in the men's bathrooms. It's obviously for transgender. Sorry, Randall, make sure I don't get this confused, for transgender men, right? Is that the right phrasing? And she's like, you could be whatever you want. And of course, that was my opening. And I said, well, could I then identify as a black man because I feel that way, and I want you to call me a black man because I identify. And then suddenly that's not acceptable to this woman wearing the Cape Cod hoodie. And she goes, no, 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 you can't, feel like a black man. But I said, well, are you saying then, even though I'm obviously a man, I can feel like a woman and that's okay? And she's like, yeah, that's okay. Then I'm like, well, I want to feel like a black man. She goes, well, now you're twisting the words and it doesn't work that way. So look, in closing, the takeaway was we clearly now have a culture, a generation that is literally making up rules and standards and expectations as we go. So I don't play that game. I know what a man is. I know what a woman is. And she couldn't, by the way, define what a man was. So that's what happened. And you can catch that story on Turning Point USA and on my social.
Well, stuff, as far as ethnicity and color, there is really, people always like to think there's a spectrum for gender or sex. And mind you, sex and gender are the same word. If you're in France, they have the gender, for the table and the ceiling and the roof, whatever. And those are male and female. There's only two of them. As far as gender going, the word for gender is, generated from gene. And basically, it's just two sets. And so the word sex and gender, sex kind of has a sexier title. People don't like to use it because they think, maybe it's a little bit off color, whatever. So they use gender, but those are equivalent. And so, there's all this distinction about sex versus gender, but then, same thing. And there's two of them because that's the way things work. And whether you're a hippopotamus, a whale, raccoon, these other species don't seem to be having this argument so much because perhaps they are, on the cusp of living or dying because, nature's parsimony. They only have a certain amount to eat. They have to kind of keep on the road and work their way through life as a raccoon or whatever. And they don't have time to debate these, esoteric topics such as we do. God bless them. Total side note. I was kind of out last night walking to a restaurant with my wife, and there's a kind of wooded area near where we are. And I saw this skulking figure by a creek side through the bushes and whatnot. And I kind of like recoiled a little bit because we have occasional coyote, sometimes a fox. And he looked like a fox. He had the coloration of a fox. And all of a sudden, instantly, I knew it wasn't a fox because the thing was a little bit fuller form. It was not skinny. All the foxes I ever see are completely rail thin because they just have enough food to be foxes. If there's more food, there'd be more foxes. And when their food runs out, there are fewer foxes. So the fox food ratio, whatever, the things they can find, keeps them right on what I call the edge of parsimony. And there's just enough. We as a society figured out so much luxury. We have the luxury of doing all the things that kind of like brought the decay of the Roman Empire. And it kind of I forget the name of the cycle, but basically, hard times lead to soft people lead to hard times. There's more steps and gradations there. But we seem to be on this ramp where we're just kind of like, being willfully, frivolous and stupid, kind of like the foofy people in the Hunger Games with their big hairdos. We make fun of them, but that's kind of where we are. And the irony is that, the thing that actually is immutable, your sex, that's mutable, that's changeable. But the thing that's not, your ethnicity, your genetic makeup and race and so forth, that's really on a blur. We've been mixing and matching people, forever. My wife teaches and she has a class, and she noticed there were, a couple of students who were very, very black. They're much, much darker skinned than others. And I said, oh, they're from Africa. She's like, oh, I don't think so. Anyway, she went back, and yes, they're both from Africa because African blacks are more black than American blacks. And so there's, what we call black, there's a gradation. And it's like, the funny thing is, but that's immutable. You cannot do blackface. That would be horrible. But you can do woman face, which is like somehow like totally cool. Anyway, sorry for that digression.
Well, look, I wanted to just simply add, you're a doctor. Correct me if I'm wrong. Getting back to the genes and that there are only two sets. You and I today could identify as females, which we do not. But when we die, at the end of the day, it'll clearly show that, you take our DNA that we were dudes, right?
Absolutely. I like diagnosing people, as kind of a part-time thing from afar. You can kind of see what people are up to, and at one point, I was able to identify, you can kind of see menopausal versus pre versus postmenopausal women on the beach because their body type changes when they lose their estrogen. They kind of get a little bit more mannish figure. They lose some of their curves. You can tell basically with hardly even work, even where people wearing ski clothes. I was on the ski slopes recently. It's not that hard to tell a woman form from a male form. The way they move, the way the legs are angulated, the hips are different. It's not that hard if you're paying attention. And that, even if you wind up being a decorated military person, and you think you're a woman, you're a guy. And this is just the nature of life. Women don't have prostates, blah, blah, blah. This is pretty simple stuff, but it's there in a sense, like in Orwellian terms in 1984, the object of 2 + 2 equals 5 is not that 2 + 2 equals 5. It's to get somebody to say that. And that not have the courage to say otherwise because of ramifications and repercussions. So, I think it's mostly a power dynamic, and what we're seeing play out in all these things is power dynamic. Anyway, that's my talking too much, and I apologize because I'm interviewing you. But it is interesting stuff. So what is it like working for Christopher Rufo and/or Turning Point as well? I don't think they're the same. How do you manage to kind of get these gigs? What's new and bubbling on that scene, and where do you see the kind of panorama of news reporting playing out?
Well, that's a really interesting question. If those, Christopher Rufo obviously is arguably one of the most, influential conservative activist journalists out there, and Turning Point USA is arguably one of the fastest growing conservative media movements out there. And I would not have crossed paths with these two entities just a few years ago before I moved to Seattle. Because, look, it's so you understand my politics. I want to say right now I'm technically an independent. I don't subscribe to any particular political party. But growing up in Massachusetts, I was essentially a JFK Democratic liberal by default. And what that meant was, hey, we can agree to disagree, but we're going to cross the aisle, find a solution for the greater good, right? Compromise. So I saw that growing up, and I just always not being too political, said, we got to support the Democrats. They're on the right side of history. Well, I moved to Seattle 3.5 years ago, and it's the height of COVID. It's the height of the Black Lives Matter protests. I see, homeless encampments everywhere, people doing fentanyl, on the streets, open air drug use. None of it's being enforced by the cops. I end up reporting on what's happening, and my stories do not fit the narrative according to the far left here in Seattle. And I think that was the turning point for me when I got canceled, when they essentially called me a fascist, a Nazi, a right-wing extremist for simply reporting what's happening on the ground, but the fact that it didn't fit the narrative for them. And that's when I was like, okay, I might have to start voting Trump. I mean, it was that much of a wild swing for me. But anyway, long story short, I'm now independent, and MSNBC hasn't called, CNN hasn't called, none of the liberal outlets have called, but a lot of the conservative media groups and personalities out there resonate with my work. And again, I focus primarily on homelessness, and public safety and the drug addiction crisis on the West Coast. But like you said, we're in an information war right now, okay? And when it comes to mainstream legacy media, it's predominantly liberal. And I'll give you an example. When it comes to the homeless debate, what you're going to hear a lot of times, Randall, and I kind of fell for this as well when I was working for corporate media. Whenever I did a story about homelessness, it was usually on Thanksgiving, right? You go to the homeless shelter and everyone's serving turkey and everyone feels good and we're doing our good deed for the day, moving on. Or when we did a story about homelessness, we'd ask, so what's the solution to homelessness? A lot of times we'd find these so-called experts in the field or the advocates for the homeless, and they'd say, we just need more affordable housing. But now that I'm finally on this beat and digging and doing the research and seeing it for myself and recording all of this, I'm realizing the root causes are not the lack of affordable housing, but mental illness, drug addiction, and broken relationships. And that's a narrative you're rarely going to hear on NPR or CNN or MSNBC, because first of all, they barely cover this topic because homelessness is icky. It's not brand safe. Nobody wants to see people suffering or dying or overdosing on cable news. They'd rather watch, a bake sale around the corner happening with the Girl Scouts, I guess. But anyway, my point is, I realized that, at this point, sort of quote unquote conservative media is the space that will actually take my stories and also back my stories. And that's why I'm collaborating now more than anything else. But just for the record, I'm an independent journalist right now, and my politics are independent as well.
Well, I appreciate that, and thank you. I've I'm older, I believe, than you, and I've been around for a while. I'm in my 60s, and I remember a time when there was mental illness, because that's been forever. I remember a time when people struggled with poverty, because that's been forever. But I also remember that there were not people encamped on city streets throughout our nation. And I remember a time when New York City wasn't filled with scaffoldings, outside their buildings. Most of these things, I lived in Boston for a long time. Now I'm in a leafy suburb, but when there was a kind of a massive traffic thing, jam, not, on one of the city streets, almost invariably was because there was a policeman at the front of it, managing traffic. Kind of the man-made aspect made a bad, kind of congested traffic problem worse, because he might be talking to somebody, might get interested in one car or get angry, whatever, and everything kind of stops because he's not a traffic light. I only bring that up as an example that most of the big problems, the shortages we have, those are in a sense law made. They're man made, and the homeless thing pivoted in our country. I'm not sure the exact date that it happened, but it's kind of gotten worse in California, and then it's been rippling out, I think, from a misinterpretation of a law. And I don't know if you want to speak to it. I don't know if you're familiar with the Boise versus Martin case. And my shorthand interpretation of their interpretation is that we can't take somebody off the street unless there is a house for him. Because there was I guess Martin was represented by maybe the ACLU or something like that in Boise, and he objected to being peeled off the street, and there was no place for him to go.
Right. You're right. Housing or shelter. Right.
So I think this has led to the laissez-faire aspect of homeless encampments and whatnot, and kind of the trash. I don't know what the verb for noun for the trashization, the trashing of cities, underpasses, byways. I mean, I was out in California not too long ago, and it's we're seeing it here as well, but there's just thousands of yards of people just with trash spewed all over the place. What are the kind of the law aspects of this, and or misinterpretations of how this can be policed, and what are the solutions that you might propose if that's something you really want to dig into?
Well, yeah, that's pretty much the work that I focus on now at Discovery Institute, at the Center on Wealth and Poverty. We have senior fellows. We've got a team that actually does the research and digs into this stuff. Randall, what's fueling all of this is, not only the fentanyl, the unprecedented fentanyl crisis that we're dealing with now, but as you alluded to, failed public policies and really the misinterpretation of laws. I'll give you an example: Martin versus Boise. Here in Burien, Washington, the suburb right outside of Seattle, a local, county official said, "Hey, you can't move these encampments because there aren't any shelters in Burien." But the Burien City Council actually said, "No, you're misinterpreting the law. Even though we may not have enough shelters in the city of Burien for the homeless here before we can sweep them off the streets, there are actually shelters in nearby Kent, Washington, in nearby Seattle, Washington, and we can drive them there. And if they refuse, we're going to arrest them or we're going to sweep them out." So you've got to have, a strong leadership that will move with conviction on actually enforcing the laws on the books and correctly interpreting the laws on the books. So this, I don't want to get into all the legal nuance, but really what's fueling all of this right now is starting at the federal level at HUD, right? Housing and Urban Development. They came out during the Obama administration more than a decade ago with a strategy called Housing First. I think the average American is clueless about what Housing First is because people aren't studying the homeless space, but we have at Discovery Institute. And what Housing First essentially says, it's a federal mandate that in order for local jurisdictions to get funding, for nonprofits to get funding for helping the homeless, you must put them into apartments or buildings, no strings attached. It's basically a voucher system. So no strings attached means no requirements to get treatment, no requirements to deal with your addiction, no requirements to find a job. Let's just essentially warehouse everybody out of sight, out of mind. And Obama said we would end homelessness in America. Well, 10 years later, homelessness in America is now up 12%. That's more than 650,000 Americans. That includes veterans, women, and children. So Housing First is an epic failure. Yet we're still doubling down on this failed strategy. And that's what continues to ravage these West Coast cities. Because I talk to nonprofit leaders, I talk to the folks who aren't fueling the homeless industrial complex, which I call. That essentially means there are obviously groups out there that are benefiting from this multi-billion-dollar industry, and they don't want to solve homelessness, because if they solve homelessness, the $300,000 CEO salaries at these nonprofits go away. Jobs go away as well. So that's why I call it the homeless industrial complex. But some of the nonprofits will tell me secretly off the record, Jonathan, if we don't follow this Housing First strategy, even though we know it's not working, we're not going to get federal funding. And we need to stay funded to at least try to help the homeless. This is a racket, Randall. It's no longer a conspiracy theory. This is a racket happening in America.
Well, a lot of that resonates with my own experiences. I ran a primary care practice in Revere, Massachusetts for 27 years on my own. And through the latter parts of it, in the noughts and the teens, I did a gentle 4-month tapering from opiate addiction to sobriety. And so I had a sobriety model, and I didn't buy into the disease model, and I didn't want people to be on narcotics forever. And I actually wrote a book at the time. I didn't publish it because I got into hot water. I kind of got canceled myself a little bit, and that's its own story. And the book is probably publishable now, but basically it's Withdrawal to Freedom. And in my book, I actually mentioned a term of art, which reminded me what you said. I call it the methadone industrial complex. And this is channeling Eisenhower's term, the military industrial complex. And and herein is the same type of thing. It's kind of a rent-seeking proposal where the people who are ostensibly treating a problem benefit from treating it, and they don't want to get rid of their own jobs. And back in the Bill Clinton era, he touted a book by David Osborne called Reinventing Government. And in that book, Osborne puts out that most of the agencies that are around you don't really have an interest in fully getting rid of the problem, because that would make themselves obsolete.
Right.
And so firemen, obviously they want to fix fires, but they don't want to make fires go away because there would be no need for firemen. Ditto crime to a certain extent. You need to have the police there. The police budget increases, blah, blah, blah. And I was mentioning this just the other day. Because of smoke detectors, fire alarms, with the internet, basically centralized alarm systems, so forth. There are, I think, only 5% of the number of actual significant fires there used to be in the 1970s per capita and per city and so forth. And the number of firemen are more than ever. So they've kind of, transmuted into quasi EMTs. They show up for heart attacks, even though that it's not literally heart burning. And whatnot. And so, most of these what I'll call them kind of sinecure unionized professions, they don't want to get rid of that. And the same thing will happen with, NGOs and whatnot, who want, a problem not to fully go away. So I think you're really tapping into something there. And just to kind of segue a little bit to my own interest, as far as the narcotics go, having people endlessly on methadone, and this started in the 70s as well. It used to be that like alcohol, if you were an alcoholic and you were on a total binge, for a number of months, they want to fix you. The first thing to do is sober you up. There's no replacement alcohol. If you're on a whiskey problem, they don't say, here's this clear stuff, looks like water. Take this like every few hours. Oh my God, it gets rid of my jitter. What is it? It's vodka. Nobody's on a vodka replacement. But for heroin, they put you on methadone, which is basically, slower heroin, but heroin-like an opioid. And they put you on Suboxone, which is buprenorphine, which rhymes with morphine. And these are narcotics. I mean, they might be not as dopey as some of the other ones, might not be as dopey as fentanyl, and likely to put you to death and whatnot. but they're still narcotics. And what we've done is siloed. We've created a whole bulwark of people who don't, taper their doses down. So they have a physical need. If they leave the methadone or they leave the Suboxone clinics, they're back having an immediate narcotic need. And the alcoholics, if you sober them up, at least in the meanwhile, they're not alcohol needy. They might have other problems. They might become, on alcohol again. But what we've done in our good intentions, where the road to hell is paved, obviously, is we've created a problem that perpetuates itself, and not necessarily at the benefit of those we are ostensibly treating, but sometimes at the benefit of those treaters, or in this case, quasi the pharmaceutical industry who's making the methadone, Suboxone, whatnot. So there's like a dynamic where these groups kind of form their own self-perpetuating guilds. Anyway, that's another diatribe. I apologize, but
I can relate.
Yeah, you were speaking a little bit about kind of the narcotic and the mental health illness. So let's say your town does pick them up and they go someplace else. How does it become not just a kind of a shell game? What is the actual possibility of people getting better or getting out of that loop? As far as you can
look, Randall, I mean, thanks for asking. At Discovery Institute, and what I personally believe is, it's not housing first. It's about recovery first. We have to have requirements. We have to have interventions for these men and women living on the streets. I mean, look, President Biden, we all know he has a son, Hunter. He has a drug addiction, and he's been battling it for, 15 plus years. And, the Biden family did an intervention. The Biden family did whatever it took, poured tons of resources into saving Hunter Biden. Yet, why don't we have that same expectation and standard and process for the men and women living on the streets? Hunter Biden didn't go through harm reduction. What harm reduction essentially means, depending where you live, is, at least here in Seattle and King County, you get a brown baggie and it's packed with fentanyl foil and test strips, needles, and meth pipes, along with Narcan. So if you overdose, you can be revived, hopefully. I mean, and these baggies are being given out like candy. In fact, I did a little experiment, and, I took my kids who are 13 and 14 years old to a harm reduction clinic, and they were giving out baggies to them, no questions asked. I mean, this is seriously, in my opinion, sinister. These folks in this industry, I'm sure there are some good people who want to see people recover and get better, but there are others who are just passing this stuff out and believe that there are some people who will be addicted to drugs and will do drugs forever. So that type of culture mindset needs to change, we believe. And we need to have requirements. People need to earn their way into housing. I mean, we've got to be focusing more, resource into medical beds, treatment beds for detox. I mean, look, this is the worst kept secret, Randall. We're not asking for more money necessarily. It's all about redistributing the money that's being wasted on apartments and studios for the homeless right now in places like Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Portland that are all under, this housing first model right now that needs to change. And making matters worse is what they're doing is they're taking these models, these drug addicts, these people with mental illnesses, untreated, and dumping them into urban cores, making the crime even worse. The 911 calls going up like crazy, and the overdose deaths right there. Look at my videos. I mean, I captured more than 24 just in the past year, people dying from fentanyl on the streets. And this is America, man. This is unbelievable that this is being allowed.
No, I completely agree. And I thank you for your work. I think it's, there's bravery there. I do notice, I've read something recently that, well, first of all, there's an old joke about the war on drugs. Drugs won. The war on poverty. Poverty won. Most of these wars we put out, they wind up self-propagating, which is an interesting phenomenon. Because I think, people don't want to talk about God. They don't want to talk about men's souls. But frankly, people, I think, however you want to phrase it, but Chesterton, I think, said there's a God-sized hole within every person. And so people need to fill that hole one way or another. And when they can't find it, when they know they're not living the best lives they can, and not pursuing a pathway towards that, they tend to become dissolute, and they go downward. Now, in medicine, I'm not sure if we could still have this expression, but in medical school, we had the expression, alcoholics go to ground. And what they meant by that, and you needed a little demo for it, you need to have something that you're dropping. I'll use my glasses. But the concept was that alcoholics didn't stop going down until they hit something that they couldn't go further down from. And that was when they got their lives clean. So when you help them out, like if they're out there with a tin cup, I need money for food, it's going to alcohol. And when there's any kind of, like, it sounds perverse, but any of the kind of help and the smoothing out, the comforting, the parachuting, on cushioning that fall, it just delays the fact, the moment of realization when people have to get and fix their lives. George W. Bush, self-proclaimed alcoholic, and probably cocaine-aholic, found God. And I'm not saying everyone's going to find God in the same way. And AA is basically a placeholder as a religion. But if people don't find some structure and some ability to do that, kind of find the better, what if you want to call it religion, but find that faith, that sensibility of where they should be, and find the wherewithal within themselves, within their own souls, and within their, kind of like community to do that, they will not. They will not flourish. It's kind of like a house plant left in an empty place. It might live for a while, and then it can't. And that which can't continue doesn't. So it's kind of for me, it was a very telling aspect of my treatment that people, they needed to flourish, and they would only flourish, in the surroundings of friends and family and faith, and as well as funds, finding work and whatnot. And it's a very difficult thing to apply these things when you give people the essential goal of a house, whatever. It's something they can't manage. It's not that they're homeless per se. I mean, a lot of them are homeless in the same sense that I'm yachtless or I'm jetless. I never had a jet. I never had a yacht. I wouldn't know what to do with one. I can't afford one. I can't manage one. I can't keep one. And so a yacht and a jet would be misplaced with me. Now, a car I can manage, and I've been doing well with a house. But a lot of people are not homeless in the sense that they had one. If a tornado whisks your home away, yeah, you're homeless. But most of these people are, you're calling, they're indigent and they're needy, and they may or may not have the wherewithal to do it. But insofar as they do, if they're not just mental illness, it's kind of bad times, a lot of it's going to have to come from this soulful place. And, the Salvation Army does that, I think, to a certain extent. But we've kind of moved away from some of the faith-based initiatives. And I'm not, a religious proselytizer. I do not do that. I don't go out and tell people what they should do. But the fact of the matter is that we tend to ignore, the way that people actually come out with their own spirits and souls. And we're trying to apply this in a materialist sense and give them stuff. And I think that's a kind of a misapplication. Anyway, third diatribe, I apologize.
No, well said. I'll just simply respond by saying I agree with you 100%. And, in the 4 years now that I've been on this, homeless beat, I've met many men and women. I've interviewed them, and I have them on the record essentially saying, hey, we just got an apartment. And I said, well, hey, isn't that great? And they said, yeah, but they're always telling me it's empty. My friends aren't there. I don't have family. So they end up having an apartment, but going back to the encampment. And I'm like, why are you back here, Mary? Don't you have an apartment to go to? And she tells me, my family's here. This is my community. In other words, Randall, I mean, these men and women, at the end of the day, I believe they all have souls and they're searching for meaning and purpose. But when you just put them in a sterile apartment, without this community or meaning or purpose or any pathway to find work, you're just warehousing people out of sight, out of mind. And here in Seattle, I'm afraid we're building ghettos now in the sky. I mean, we're talking about taking, as the commercial real estate right now industry is suffering for various reasons. COVID obviously didn't help. And we've got all these empty buildings in the downtown core, yet we've got all these homeless people, 50,000+ homeless people in King County. And we're now talking about putting them in these office buildings. I mean, it just blows my mind what we're talking about here right now, rather than dealing with the root causes. And again, one of those is, filling this, huge void in your soul. And unfortunately, the faith-based groups that have been there since the beginning. You alluded to the Salvation Army, in the Union Gospel Mission, doing incredible work out here. They're doing far more with far less in resources. But what they do is they walk with people all the way, the discipleship process, until the end, until they make it. But unfortunately, a lot of these, government entities and agencies now, they won't work with the faith-based groups because of the position on LGBTQ issues. And that's one of the reasons why Union Gospel Mission doesn't get funding. And they prefer it that way. They prefer to be independent and do it their own way through that personal touch, one person at a time.
Yeah, no, a lot of the laws have been perverse. Catholic Charities was the major group in Massachusetts. From my experience, I can't speak statistically, but from what I saw through my practice over the years, they were the major group in helping young children, and they were helping with adoption and fostering and so forth. And they were a careful group. They found good families, and they, the kids who went through there, I'm not saying their lives were perfect, because they were not perfect, but they had a better chance from what I saw from the other groups. And Catholic Charities, when the gay marriage was unilaterally discerned and divined by, I think her name is Margaret Mitchell, same as the author of Gone with the Wind, the judge in Massachusetts in the 80s, early 90s, mid 90s. Anyway, when that happened, Catholic Charities did not bend. They would not do that. Place children in a place where there wouldn't be, the man and wife married, and they're Catholic, and they got banned from any further adoption care. And they wouldn't, I think the government was expecting to change, but they didn't. And I think the result is there's diminishment in the standards for the house, foster care and whatnot. And we've seen kind of a dereliction. We know more stuff than ever. We have Library of Congress and sitting in our pocket, and yet we have kind of lost some of the moorings that society needs, that are not in simple documents and probably just within our interactions. Anyway, we're kind of rounding out towards the end of the hour. I'd like to hear a little bit of what excites you. What are your prospects? What are the optimistic things you can mention? And what are your next goals in journalism?
Yeah, well, I'm still hopeful. At the end of the day, I wouldn't be here if I wasn't hopeful. And that's what I'm also trying to show in my reporting. We're, this next year going to be focusing on potential solutions, strategies and, proof of concept that's working, in other parts of the nation when it comes to dealing with the homeless crisis and drug addiction crisis. So I'm excited about that. But what I'm really excited about is, big picture is the state of American journalism. While no doubt the data shows that traditional media consumption is in decline, we're seeing a rise in independent journalism. More people now, depending on your age group. I mean, the latest television, again, that's my world. Data shows, the average viewer here in Seattle watching local news is like 59 years old, or you're in a nursing home. Everyone else, the millennials, Gen Z, they're consuming off of their tablets and phones. I talked to my former news director the other day, and he's like, "Hey, Choe, I'm seeing all your work on X off my phone. You're doing a great job." And I'm like, "Thanks." Getting back to what you said earlier, it's also because we're doing stories that no one else is covering, or we're, talking about, perspectives and issues and angles that nobody else wants to touch for various reasons. So I'm excited about doing that work and continuing to really also encourage other younger journalists and also some of the old dogs to maybe pivot down this road, because I have several friends who are working in the Seattle market who are seeing the success that we've had, and they're asking me, "Hey, how do I become an independent journalist now?" So, anyone watching this, if you want to reach out and you want to jump into this field, I really feel like citizen journalism, where, the average Joe or Jane who has a full daytime job now has access to iPhones. We all have iPhones or, mobile phones, and, all you have to do is hit record, and boom, just like that, you're in the game. So we're about training up also now the next generation. So we're going to be focused on stuff like that, Randall.
Well, I appreciate that, and I put up here your YouTube channel, and well, here's your X page, Jonathan Choe, journalist, Seattle, and you are. I think that's irrefutable, and I appreciate the work you're doing in actual journalism. In our green room, let me just put up the Discovery Institute here. This is discovery.org. And they're helping support your work, I gather.
And actually, if you don't mind, if you're able to right now, my primary landing page at the Center on Wealth and Poverty is actually fixhomelessness.org. Fixhomelessness.org is where you can see a lot of our work. And, again, Discovery Institute is not just, our program that focuses on homelessness. Again, we're primarily known for intelligent design. And we have some of the, world's best academics. But that's it right there. That's where you can see a lot of my work under the Street Report banner, and some of my other colleagues in, Austin, Texas, Marvin Olasky, Dr. Robert Marbert Jr. They're doing incredible work as well, more on the research and academic side. And I'm just sort of that frontline grunt who goes into all these crazy situations to show what's going on, and they kind of bring in the academic heft behind my work.
Well, I appreciate that. It takes a certain amount of bravery. I'm not sure how you pronounce Andy, NGO. I don't want to call him Andy. Andy, no. I call him Andy, non-governmental organization, for short. But, that it comes with, he was attacked, and there's some brutal aspects of it. And if it seems like the left gets carte blanche and
That's right.
free, get out of jail free card, or never get into jail free card. And
double standard.
It's I have a lot of moral equivalence friends who thinks, oh, it comes from the left, comes from the right, violence comes from the left, but it's not. I think there's a big directional vector. It's hard to swim upstream. So I want to appreciate and thank you for all your efforts here. For people who want to support my video cast and get entertaining and wonderful, thoughtful guests such as Jonathan Choe, you can buy my book. You can you could, I guess, send money to me directly, but why don't you do this? And I'll give us a little share to Amazon. If you buy my book, Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. It's fascinating stuff because a lot of, the themes that we mentioned above about journalism, this story got pushed, I think, somewhat malevolently and malfeasantly in Brazil. It probably would not have been turned into the great, quote unquote, pandemic or panic that it was in 2015-16, and people may not start to remember it much anymore, but it was a big deal. It was the biggest pandemic worldwide to that date. Something else came after. I start with a C. I can't remember, COVID or whatever. And anyway, but
because I hear if you get the vaccine, Randall, you'll never get COVID again. That's what I'm hearing.
They're actually working on a Zika vaccine right now. They're injecting and infecting women in Baltimore with Zika, even though Zika, for all intents and purposes, does not cause microcephaly. It's a dengue virus, and dengue never caused microcephaly. None of the flaviviruses, including hepatitis C, ever caused microcephaly at all. No congenital problems with the flaviviruses as a class or dengue, and Zika is basically the fifth dengue. None of that. And it's never caused, even in Brazil, ever since. And probably in that first year was not a thing. It was probably a misconstruing of data. Yet, the point about the journalism part is that because it coincided with people's wanting to overturn the abortion constraints in Brazil, they kind of raised us up the flagpole really fast so people could salute and get emergency injunctions promoting abortion on the precept that there was a possibility of microcephaly in the baby, and they couldn't tell. There were no Zika tests, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so a lot of these things get pushed one way or another as agenda politics. And that's, it wasn't, I came upon the story kind of out of the blue. I'm not going to get into that. It's in the book. But anyway, so you can help support my podcast by buying it. Here it is once again. And I'm going to take it off the screen so we can say goodbye to each other, Jonathan and I. So any last words, Jonathan?
No, thank you again for this opportunity, Randall. I mean, it's always, awesome to rap about, the realities that's happening on the ground. And again, this is a conversation you're not going to see on mainstream media. So, keep up the fight as well on your end, and hold down the fort in our hometown, my hometown of Boston, Massachusetts.
Yeah, well, I got an interesting couple of Michelle Wu's thoughts. I'm going to probably spare them for online, but my feeling is that Boston managed reasonably well. Didn't turn into Seattle as left as it is. I think politically we're just as left. But we had, for the most part, mayors who liked the people. Marty Walsh and Menino and Ray Flynn and whatnot. Through the years, all Democrats. Kevin White, going back, decades. But the mayors, I think, liked the people. They would, theoretically have a beer with them. I think Michelle Wu is a different character. I think she's a Liz Warren-ish clone, and she has disdain for the actual people. I think she pretends to like the down class, but really she's kind of an up class kind of gal. And anyway, she's playing out kind of miserably, I think, and I think Boston will start to join Seattle's descent, unfortunately. Anyway, well, that's a prediction. We'll see how it goes.
I take it you didn't get an invite to our non-whites Christmas
Well, the
party,
funny
right?
thing is, I identify as, I identify as a 14-year-old Martian.
Well, you would have qualified then. I'm sorry you didn't get the invite, Randall.
I don't know. I mean, some people just don't believe in extraterrestrials. I feel so kind of triggered by that. I don't know. I don't know where to go.
You're using the right language, Randall.
Yeah. All right. Well, you have a lovely rest of the day, and I appreciate your time. I'll have this posted up soon. Thank you so much for being with us.
Anytime. Take care.
Bye.